Well, Timur, thank you for that introduction. And unfortunately, I've been so busy thinking about this weekend, I haven't had a chance to read a book recently, or I probably would have used that instead of the text I prepared. But as it turned out, you gave me a text that wasn't a book, but something that I can use as its equivalent. I had the privilege of coming here yesterday, and I was told after I checked in that we were going to go to dinner, but I wasn't told I was going to get my own copy without paying $5. For the Muslim world, have you heard about this? A special issue? Not special because of the editors? Every teacher can also be a student. So I've learned from Timur a few tricks. But I have to say that when I was given this, what I often do is to read other people's essays, and then I realized I kind of forgotten what I wrote. So I picked it up last night, and I'm going to save you the trouble of buying it. You know, not that my essay is the only one you need to read, but if you're going to buy it for that reason, you don't need to do it. In the last paragraph, I read and I thought, oh gosh, I'm in deep yogurt. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. But my essay was on the late Sheikh Osama bin Laden, about whom I can say very humbly that Dr. Yahya Michaud, sitting here, knows more about not the man himself, but sort of the spirit that animated the man than I'll ever know. And Yahya, you don't need to say why I think that, but I do appreciate your visual catalog. So with that remark aside, I just want to say that I looked at this essay I wrote on the late Sheikh Osama bin Laden and realized that I had rewritten it a couple months ago, roughly around May. And this is what I said in May. It's only late spring, 2011. On the cusp of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, America, thank God, has not been hit again in any of its vulnerable physical spots. Yet it must remain ever vigilant about the ideology that produced Al-Qaeda and that still threatens to outlive the man. The battle against bin Laden is over, noted one sober analyst after he was killed, after Osama bin Laden was killed the 2nd of May 2011. This, by the way, is Max Boot, the senior editor of the Wall Street Journal. According to Max Boot, the battle against bin Laden is over, but the battle against bin Ladenism, that is the ideology of bin Laden or bin Ladenism, continues. And then I add my own commentary. One can dare to hope that the uptick of the Arab Spring, which began before Osama bin Laden was killed, may produce not a summer of discontent, but a fall of hope, followed by a winter of reform and renewal. The only answer to Armageddon, not the evangelicals that Nick knows and talked about, but some of those whom are sure that the world's coming to an end, and it's already been ordained by the book of Revelation, just took a little long to happen. So all those people who are Armageddon on the Christian side or the Muslim side, the only answer to them is not more military strikes against Al-Qaeda or more efforts to root out the Taliban. And this is a key phrase, in case you're wondering why I'm quoting it. The key phrase is now, alliances of culture and education, economics and health, which produce a global order unassailable either by polemicists certain to succeed bin Laden or militants whom they hope to commit to their cause. Now the crucial word there is order. Global order. I think a lot about order. I think about order even before I know that one of the most popular books that I'm not going to talk about today is The Sources of Political Order by Francis Fukuyama, which talks about all the different threads in history that have been obsessed with order. And I thought, I have a whole set of comments I'm going to make about the Arab Spring and about the Ark of Hope in Islam. But I have to come back to this word order because I'm in Hartford. Why? Why is order in Hartford so connected? Well, because last night, when Timur was taking me to the hotel where I stayed before we went out to dinner, he said, we picked this hotel because we hope it doesn't have ants. We've had some complaints about the previous hotel we've used that it has been occupied with ants. And the people who we brought here have not appreciated those extra residents in their room. Well, what he didn't tell me is that there are no ants in my room, but there was a spectral spirit in that room. And that spectral spirit was Hartford, as I kind of remembered. Remember, I do come from Connecticut. I lived here for a long time, by the way. My brother, who's here, also lived in Connecticut and still has deeper attachments, closer attachments, at least, to Connecticut than I do. So it's not as if I'm coming to a foreign territory, but I'm coming back here after a long time to Hartford. And I kept thinking, why is it that I don't see ants, but I feel something else sort of around me and inside me? And then I recognized that spirit that was waiting to be acknowledged was Wallace Stevens. Now, for those of you who've been to Hartford too short a time, or you have been here and not read poetry, you might not know the name Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens also worked for an insurance company in Hartford, so he had to make a living. He wrote poetry at night, which is probably why he wasn't too wealthy, but he produced a wealth of riches, of lyrical riches for others, including myself. I've read, admired, quoted, lived, breathed new things in my life because of reading Wallace Stevens. And he came back to me last night, so here's what I have to share with you from Wallace Stevens. It's a short line of poetry, and actually it's written more as a kind of declaration than a poem. And it has two propositions. The first he calls Proposition A. A violent order equals disorder. That's Proposition A. A violent order equals disorder. And then there's Proposition B. A great order equals order. A lot of order. So let me just read it again. Proposition A, a violent order equals disorder. B, a great order equals order. So you have order and disorder as contrast, but also violent order paired with, but seemingly contrasting with, great order. And I didn't give you the last line. So Proposition A, a violent order equals disorder, a great order equals order. These two things are one. These two things are one. So you immediately have to go back and reread. And you think, oh, so there's something about violence and greatness, whatever greatness means, because greatness is not defined. But many of the commentaries that say greatness only comes from law. So let's just say law. A lawful order is a great order. A lawful order and a violent order are always kind of intertwined. And order and disorder are always intertwined. We heard earlier from Ingrid Mattson, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, about Surat al-Rahman. Actually, she didn't cite it, Surat al-Rahman, but most of you Muslims know. Hal jazaa al-ihsan illa al-ihsan. There's another earlier verse from the same Surat al-Rahman, which says, "Bainahuma barzakh la yabghiyan." Between them is a barzakh, a place, la yabghiyan, which they cannot exceed. So, in one sense, what he has done, Wallace Stevens in this poem, is to create a barzakh, a realm where two things are together. They seemingly aren't alike, and yet he says they're the same. And you have to kind of be in that space, that barzakh, that in-between space that says a violent order is disorder, a great order is also order, and the two are the same. The reason I think Wallace Stevens is not just the ghost of Hartford for me, but maybe the luminary of the future for all of us, is because he pushes me to think back many, many years. He's been deceased long, long before now. But he forces me to think back to 2001. And like all of you, I can remember where I was and what I was doing that time. And I was actually engaging a good Muslim friend, Azim Naji from London, who'd flown over to give the keynote speech for a talk on Islam and aesthetics. And we heard the first, as some of you did, the first bomb, the notice of the first building being hit. and the second bomb, the second explosion, the second tower being hit. And when the second one happened, he said, the class is over, the speech is done, it was Muslims. Azim, how do you know it was Muslims? He said, my heart. He said, I don't need to go out and look at it. He said, and my heart has stopped. I'm just frozen with fear and horror at this moment. And he said, when we think ahead about what's going to happen, it will change our world forever, but it will also change the Arab world. And that's what I want to share with you. But looking 10 years back, this man who is as committed to peace as any good human being, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, pagan could ever be. He knew it was Muslims. He knew it stopped him in his own work. He worked for the Aga Khan Foundation, by the way. He was Ismaili Muslim, head of the institute there in London. He knew that it stopped and forced him to rethink what he would do as a Muslim whose life work now had to be rethought because of what was happening at the moment that he was speaking about the lofty topic of Islam and aesthetics. And so I want to follow that train of thought and not only look back 10 years to 2001, but also look ahead to 2021 and imagine what sort of world we will have and how we will see order and disorder as not two sides of the same coin, but perhaps changing sides that appear on the coin depending on how you look at the coin. They may be in fact the same thing. And so I'm going to talk about order, disorder as it's evolved, and I'm going to do it through two theses, very simple theses, which, like all simple theses, have to be unpacked and may not seem so simple at the end as they are at the beginning. But the first thesis is that without 9/11, without the horror, I call it that, not just a tragedy and not just an attack and not just a terrorist moment, but without the horror of 9/11, there would be no Arab Spring. So this great disorder, it's not only an attack and it's not only destruction, it's this great disorder which was introduced into our lives by 9/11, also had repercussions not just in America. We've heard a lot about that, and we could and maybe should direct some of our attention to how it's affected us as Americans, but how it has changed the Arab world. In the first instance, of course, it was Afghanistan, which was changed because in October of 2001, the U.S. decided that it should not simply attack bin Laden, but attack those who supported bin Laden in Afghanistan. And so there was the Allied invasion of Afghanistan in October, which began a war that's still continuing, as all of you know, is the longest standing war that the United States has ever had. We are still at war in Afghanistan, almost now 10 years. Next month, unfortunately, will mark another decade-long moment. It'll be 10 years since October 7th, which is when we invaded Afghanistan. We, the United States, with Allied support, invaded Afghanistan almost 10 years ago. And besides toppling the Taliban, it prepared the way for thinking about U.S. presence in a very graphic way that for some Arabs was not new. It was just simply a sequel to what had been the first Gulf War, the Gulf War where you may recall, but some of you are old enough to recall 1991, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and then the successful effort of the first President Bush to mount a coalition that in fact defeated Saddam Hussein, caused Kuwait to be returned to the Kuwaitis, and Iraq to be put on all kinds of lists for depriving not only them of military help, but in some sense humanitarian assistance for their population. And in a sense, that first invasion was followed by the attack on Afghanistan from an Arab perspective, and then, of course, by the invasion of Iraq itself in March of 2003. So from an Arab perspective, there was already a strong American footprint, to use a term that policymakers like, a strong footprint in the Arab/Muslim world. And then there had been much debate about why the attacks occurred. Was it because of our policy of first opposing Saddam Hussein and then eventually toppling him? Was it because that policy was opposed? Was it because Arabs/Muslims hated American values? Or was it, as some people suggested, because there is a Muslim gene, a kind of Muslim proclivity to hostility, violence towards others, and that one simply has to acknowledge this and try to figure out how to cope with it. I think all of these explanations are facile and unjustified, but I think the reason why there's been so much change in the Arab world is because there was the expectation that change was necessary, that the old order also was a disorder, and that it was going to change in ways that the rest of us couldn't perceive, but that we all had to understand. I'm a teacher. So one of the toughest changes for me was that I could not only have to go through airport security, which all of us do, not only think, again, more closely about where one went overseas, but I also had to think about how the Muslim students, which I had encouraged, even recruited, and welcomed to my university, to Duke, now had to face tougher restrictions in coming to America. And some of them chose not to go to America, to go elsewhere. So one of the things that I lost that was, to me, a great disappointment in the aftermath of 2001 is that I had fewer Muslim students from abroad, simply because not just the cost of the logistics, but the tone of their endeavor and their opportunity to come and study, not only at Duke but elsewhere, had been curtailed. The reverse is also true. Again, I'm a teacher who also takes students abroad. I not only welcome students from abroad to my university, I take them abroad. One of the very first programs that we had in the Arab world was in Yemen. And I led it with my wife, who's also an academic, and also has spent, and much of it with me, time in various countries abroad, most of them Arab and most of them Muslim majority countries. So at one point we were going to take a group of students to Yemen. It was a terrific program. There was a terrorist attack against the US Embassy the fall of the year we've been there. No more students could go to Yemen, off the protocol charts for study abroad. Now this may sound very small to you in comparison with some of the other things that changed, but it was very evident to our colleagues and counterparts in both Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and also other places we went, that the US had a presence, not merely in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in the region, and that it was one which was auguring change, but nobody was quite clear how that change would come about or what it would mean. And I would argue that it wasn't really even clear to those of us who are supposed to be experts how rapidly that change was going to happen once certain things happened. And the two things that happened that I think make it very important for us to look at order and disorder from 2001 to 2011 is the change in the availability of food. One of the most basic things in life is food, and how the cost of food increased exponentially over the last 3 years leading up to the crisis that happened in December 2010 and January 2011. And I don't think we can underestimate how important that was, and then also how young people who, not uneducated, but educated and underemployed, how people who were trained for major possibilities as professionals in their societies were not having those opportunities, and how that disappointment of youth and that huge increase of food prices combined with the American presence meant that there was an expectation that real change had to happen. And that real change meant that groups of people who had not been on the radar screen for the monarchies or for the autocracies of the Middle East, that people were beginning to feel the need for a response that they had not had in the interim from 9/11, from 2001 to January of 2011. I could go through, and in questions and answers, I'd be glad to go through what actually happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and of course Yemen, and also what is possible and has just barely begun to happen in the monarchies of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. What all of us know is that Bahrain was the only monarchy of the group that was rocked, but it was not toppled by the first wave of revolutionary change. But my second thesis is, not only was there the possibility of change after 9/11, but there was a mandate for it, because some of those groups that had been assisted by American aid in the so-called War on Terror thought that they were protected if they could identify terrorists within their borders. So that, for instance, one of the places where I've spent a lot of time is Egypt. And one of the things that we heard from many people, colleagues of ours, as well as Egyptians that we met through our visits there, was that Egypt had these terrorist groups, and they had been outlawed from participating in politics, and that meant that Mubarak was being credited with holding the front line of the war on terror. He was putting down terrorists. In fact, the people who are sometimes called terrorists or Islamists, that's another word that's used, were people who wanted to be part of a process which they saw as having only partially opened or having been falsely presented as open to them, and they actually wanted to be real players and not sideline players in the running of their own country. So, and this also happened in Tunisia, where I lived for almost 4 months at one point. Ben Ali said, nobody will ever attack me because we have kept the Islamists at bay. We've forced them to go overseas, and we've taken money in order to squash them at home. Very proud of and by the way, we also protect women. We have a whole bureau that is in charge of women's affairs. And sure enough, there were Tunisian women who said how great Ben Ali was to women. But there are a lot of women who couldn't get employed through that same Department of Women Affairs in the previous government in Tunisia. So in one sense, those people who were autocrats in the Arab/Muslim world felt protected because they were in the front line on the war on terror and America wouldn't touch them. But the other people who had been influenced by the same change due to our military presence, the United States military presence, but also due to the escalating food prices and also to the wide-scale unemployment, the so-called youth bulge, they wanted change, and an episode tripped it off, but it wasn't any episode. The episode that everyone heard about in December 2010 was the third episode of somebody killing himself because of not being able to practice his trade. The other two were not recorded in Al Jazeera. The third one was. And so the role of local, this wasn't CNN, this certainly wasn't Fox News, this was Al Jazeera that picked up this episode, broadcast and rebroadcast, and suddenly people realized that there was not only an asymmetry of power, unpower, not only an order that concealed a larger disorder, but that there was a vacuum between the values of those people who ruled and the needs of those people who were ruled. And so that began what really has been a fast escalation. And everything you read about it has to be bracketed with this, that nobody was prepared for it and nobody was prepared for the pace of it. So one of the things that brings me to my second thesis is that in 2021, if 2011 depended on 2001, 2021 depends on order and disorder continuing apace, but recognizing that the disorder will never disappear and that we have to confront it even when we think order has been restored. So let me just sort of say why I think that 2021 will be a cause for hope. The title I gave to my talk was Arc of Hope, and it wasn't just a fictive or just a table talk topic. I really do think that there will, or there already is, the shape of an arc of hope. Maybe it's a rainbow. Maybe it still isn't clear how it's going to shape the landscape. But there is a perception of change that, from my understanding, should be marked as hope rather than disappointment, where we should be confident that we will have Arab/Muslim allies, and that we will be part of a larger global community that's better served in 2021 than in 2011. I will give you my reasons for this hope. The first is economics. I can talk about it because I'm a professor of history and religion. That is, I don't know anything about it. So having said that, I can now tell you that the one acronym I use a lot when I'm talking with others is BRIC. And they said, yes, you know, you're a brick. No, I said, no, I'm not a brick. I'm talking about brick without a K. And that's really tough when you're from Duke and everyone thinks it's Krzyzewski. Anyway, one person got that joke. BRIC is spelled B-R-I-C. Brazil, Russia, India, China. It's an acronym, but also a slogan. I first heard it actually at the TID Economic Forum in 2008. I was there, and one of the people speaking said, this is the equivalent of Davos in the Muslim world, and we want to say that we support BRIC. And everyone said, gosh, it's all sand. Where's the BRIC? And then he went on to say, Brazil, Russia, India, China. These are not only growing economies, they're going to be among the major top 15 economies in the world with increasing importance through the next decade. But what is not often talked about in the BRIC is there are going to be 2 major Muslim countries that will probably also join that club of 15 by 2021. And those top 2 countries that will be Muslim are Turkey and Indonesia.